Welcome to part 2 of point of view and perspective. In this lesson, we will be taking a look at a text to discover who the narrator is and how their perspective affects the events in the story. Before we do that, let's review some of the terms we discussed in part 1 of point of view and perspective. To begin with, the narrator is the person telling a story. The perspective is how the narrator feels about a person, event, or place. The way the narrator describes events in the story is determined by his or her feelings about the events. Authors use first and third person point of views to develop their narrator's perspective. Let's take a look at this passage. It's titled "The Settlers" by Rowena Jackson. This is a historical fiction passage about settlers and the Native American boys' experience. We're going to stop halfway through to discuss what do we learn about the narrator's perspective about the settlers. So what are his thoughts and his feelings toward the settlers? Let's begin. I crept closer and closer through the tall grass until I had a better vantage point to watch the trail of wagons pass. I'd never seen white people before, though my father sometimes traded skins and bows with them. My grandfather had warned me, "Little Bear, stay away from those men. They're dangerous." But I still wanted to see what they looked like. One wagon fell behind the rest of the caravan. The recent rain had turned the trail to thick mud, and the wagon's oxen were tired. After a few minutes, I heard a crack, and the back corner of the wagon crashed to the ground. Two people from the wagon inspected the broken wheel. I froze when one pulled out a long, shiny black stick. He pointed it in the air and made a loud pop. I crouched into a small ball in the weeds, my heart drumming in my ears. But then I saw other people running to help the stranded travelers, and I knew that the loud sound had just been a signal. Before we continue reading about the settlers, let's think a minute. We're going to look for details that show how the character feels about the settlers, and then we'll complete the chart. So one of the first things that we knew about this settlers and the narrator is who the narrator is. The narrator is being told from a first-person point of view, and we know that from the words I and my being used. That tells us this is a first-person point of view being used by the narrator. So the narrator is in the story, and our narrator's name is Little Bear. We know that because the grandfather calls him when he says he warned me, Little Bear. So our story is being told by Little Bear, so we will get Little Bear's thoughts and feelings about the events in the story. So how does Little Bear feel about the settlers? Well, the first thing we're told is that Little Bear is told that he should stay away from the settlers because they're dangerous. However, Little Bear chooses to still crouch down and ignore his grandfather's warning. So the evidence from the text is that he creeps closer and ignores his grandfather's warning. What does that tell us about how he feels and thinks about the settlers? Well, it tells us that he's curious about the settlers and is not afraid of them, or he wouldn't have been willing to get closer to them. Now we have another piece of evidence from the text that says he freezes at the sound of the rifle. He crouches into a ball and his heart beats fast. So we know that Little Bear suddenly crouches in a ball and his heart starts beating fast. This typically happens when you are scared or afraid of something. So now, based on the evidence from the text, we begin to think that Little Bear is frightened of the settlers. This is our same chart that we just had on the last page. We said we were thinking about explain how the narrator's perspective influences the reader's understanding of events. So in this case, the narrator is Little Bear, and his perspective, or how he thinks and feels, influences what he tells us. The narrator is Little Bear, so as a reader, we are hearing Little Bear's thoughts and feelings. This influences our understanding of our story because we are only seeing the story through Little Bear's eyes. Thus, we are led to believe that the white settlers could be dangerous and should be avoided. As readers, we're nervous to find out what might happen to Little Bear. Because Little Bear is telling the story, we do not get to hear the perspective of the white settlers. We don't know where they are traveling or how they feel about Little Bear and his family. So notice how it matters who the narrator is of the story, because their perspective, how they feel about things, will affect what they share. All right, let's keep reading about the settlers. Just then there was a rustle in the grass behind me. I let out a long breath that I had been holding when I saw it was just my older brother, White Deer, who silently signaled that we needed to return home before the settlers spotted us. I followed, but I paused a moment to glance back. Traveling out on the open prairie was dangerous, and the settlers were people just like us. I hope the pioneer family got their wheel fixed soon. Let's take a look at this closed reading. It says, what is Little Bear's attitude toward the white settlers in the last paragraph? Circle any clues that suggest how he feels. Remember, a closed reading is when we go back and read it for a second time. This time while we're reading, we're going to be circling any clues that tells us how Little Bear feels toward the white settlers. It says, I followed, but I paused a moment to glance back. Traveling out on the open prairie was dangerous, and the settlers were people just like us. So right there, I need to circle. Little Bear says, hey, the settlers are people just like us. So that tells us he feels like they're just like he is. I hoped the pioneer family got their wagon wheel fixed soon. Again, the fact that he says he hoped the family got their wagon wheel fixed tells us that he no longer is afraid of the white settlers. Instead, he's realized they're people just like him. It says complete the following chart by using evidence to explain the narrator's perspective at the end of the story. So the narrator is Little Bear. They want to know what is his perspective, what is his thoughts and feelings at the end of the story. Well, the evidence from the text said Little Bear hopes the family fixes its wheel. It also said that he saw the settlers were people just like us. This tells us that he is no longer afraid of the settlers. He wishes for them good things. Think about the stories that you read. Make sure that you're identifying the narrator who's telling the story. And then think about how the fact that that person, that character, is telling the story influences how the story is being told, because that person can share their thoughts and their feelings about the events.